Paris, 1940. The city of light had gone dark. Nazi boots echoed through cobblestone streets where poets once strolled, and swastika banners hung from buildings that had witnessed centuries of French glory. But in a modest apartment near the Latin Quarter, a woman sat at her piano, her fingers dancing across ivory keys while her mind calculated something far more dangerous than musical notes. Her name was Josephine Baker, and she was about to become one of the most unlikely spies in World War II history. The American-born sensation who had conquered European stages with her exotic performances and magnetic charisma was now using those very same talents to smuggle military secrets right under the noses of the Third Reich. The weapon of choice? Sheet music covered in invisible ink, carrying intelligence that would help turn the tide of the war. This is the story they buried in classified files for decades, the tale of how a black entertainer from St. Louis became a decorated war hero who risked everything while the world watched her sing. Before the darkness descended, Josephine Baker was living a dream that seemed impossible for a girl who had grown up in the Jim Crow South. Born in 1906 in Missouri, she had escaped the suffocating racism of America and found herself reborn in the welcoming embrace of Paris during the Roaring Twenties. The French capital had fallen in love with her immediately. Her performances at the Folies Bergère became legendary, her banana skirt dance became iconic, and her name became synonymous with the liberation and excitement of the Jazz Age. She was more than just an entertainer. She was a symbol of artistic freedom, a bridge between cultures, and one of the most photographed women in the world. By the time the 1930s rolled around, Baker had transcended her stage persona to become a French citizen, adopting the country that had given her the dignity and respect America had denied. She owned a chateau, raised adopted children from around the world, and had earned the genuine affection of the French people. When war came knocking on Europe's door, she had everything to lose and absolutely no obligation to fight. She could have fled to neutral territory, returned to America, or simply kept her head down and waited for the storm to pass. But Josephine Baker was not built that way. When France fell to the Nazi blitzkrieg in June of 1940, something crystallized inside her. The country that had embraced her when her own homeland had rejected her was now under the boot of an ideology that made American racism look almost quaint by comparison. The Nazis weren't just occupying territory. They were systematically destroying everything she held dear, targeting Jews, Roma, homosexuals, and anyone else who didn't fit their twisted vision of racial purity. Baker understood persecution in her bones. She had lived it, escaped it, and now she was watching it unfold on a scale that dwarfed anything she had experienced in St. Louis. While other celebrities fled or collaborated, Baker made a choice that would have been unthinkable to most people in her position. She walked into the offices of Jacques Abté, head of French military intelligence in Paris, and offered her services to the resistance. The intelligence officer was skeptical at first. What could a cabaret star possibly offer to a sophisticated espionage operation? Baker's answer was simple and devastating in its logic. She could go anywhere, meet anyone, and no one would ever suspect her of being anything more than an entertainer. The French intelligence service quickly realized they had stumbled upon an asset of extraordinary value. Baker's fame was her perfect cover, her international celebrity status an unbreakable shield. She had invitations to embassy parties. She attended high society gatherings where German officers and Vichy collaborators spoke freely, and she traveled across borders with an ease that trained spies could only dream of. But the brilliance of Baker's operation wasn't just about access. It was about the method she developed to smuggle the intelligence she gathered. Sheet music became her secret weapon, the innocent pages of musical compositions transformed into vessels of military significance. Using invisible ink made from lemon juice or more sophisticated chemical compounds provided by French intelligence, Baker would transcribe military movements, Nazi troop deployments, airfield locations, and classified information directly onto her musical scores. The beauty of the system was its elegant simplicity. Border guards and German checkpoints would search luggage, pat down travelers, and scrutinize documents with obsessive German efficiency. But who would ever think to chemically test the sheet music belonging to one of the world's most famous singers? Baker's missions took her across Vichy France, into neutral Portugal and throughout North Africa. She performed for audiences that included German officers who applauded her performances, while she memorized their conversations about troop movements. She attended parties where loose-lipped officials revealed strategic information over champagne, never imagining the beautiful entertainer smiling at their stories was recording every detail in her photographic memory. At night, back in her hotel room or in safe houses arranged by the resistance, she would carefully transcribe everything onto her sheet music using the invisible ink, creating what appeared to be nothing more than the working materials of a professional musician preparing for her next performance. The risk was absolute. If caught, Baker would face interrogation, torture, and execution. The Nazis showed no mercy to spies, and her fame would not protect her. It would likely make the propaganda value of her capture even greater for the Third Reich. Yet she continued, night after night, smuggling secrets that helped the Allies understand German positions, plan operations, and save countless lives. The world saw Josephine Baker the entertainer, the exotic dancer, the jazz singer who could make audiences weep with her rendition of a ballad. But moving through the shadows of occupied Europe was someone else entirely. A spy who weaponized her celebrity, an intelligence operative who turned musical notation into a secret language of resistance, and a woman who understood that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism happen not on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when someone chooses to risk everything for a principle larger than their own survival. The Nazi officers who attended her shows, who flirted with her at parties, who never imagined this black American woman could possibly be their enemy, were helping to orchestrate their own defeat. Every smile she gave them, every song she sang, every autograph she signed was part of an elaborate performance, far more important than anything she had ever done on stage. And the sheet music she carried, those innocent pages covered with musical notes, they were carrying secrets that would help liberate the continent she had adopted as home. The machinery of espionage required more than just courage and opportunity. It demanded a network of trust built in the shadows of occupation, and Josephine Baker found herself drawn into a web of resistance fighters, intelligence officers, and desperate patriots who were betting everything on the belief that France could be free again. Her handler Jacques Abte became more than just her contact. He became her partner in an operation that required split-second timing, nerves of steel, and the kind of improvisational brilliance that only comes from performing under pressure. Abte recognized that Baker's value extended far beyond her ability to attend parties and charm information out of loose-lipped officers. She had something that trained spies spent years trying to cultivate: genuine invisibility in plain sight. People saw what they expected to see when they looked at Josephine Baker. They saw glamour, entertainment, exoticism, and celebrity. They never saw the calculating intelligence behind those famous eyes, the photographic memory recording troop numbers, or the analytical mind piecing together fragments of overhead conversations into actionable intelligence that could save lives and change the course of battles. The system they developed was elegant in its simplicity, but terrifying in its execution. Baker would attend events, sometimes performing, sometimes simply socializing with the Vichy elite and German occupation authorities, who craved the legitimacy her presence provided. She would smile, laugh, dance, and play the role everyone expected, while her mind worked like a recording device, capturing details that seemed insignificant in isolation but became devastating when compiled and analyzed. A casual mention of troop movements, a complaint about supply shortages at a particular airfield, boasts about new defensive positions, gossip about command structure changes. Each piece was a fragment of a larger puzzle, and Baker collected them all. Then, in the safety of secure locations, she would meet with Abte and other resistance contacts to debrief, turning her observations into intelligence reports that needed to reach London and the Free French forces gathering in exile. This was where the sheet music became crucial. Baker couldn't carry typed reports or coded messages without raising suspicion, but she could carry her professional materials without anyone questioning their presence. The invisible ink technology they employed was both ancient and cutting-edge. Some messages were written with simple lemon juice that would reveal itself when heated, a technique spies had used for centuries. But French intelligence also provided her with more sophisticated chemical compounds that required specific reagents to develop, making the messages virtually undetectable, even if someone suspected the sheet music contained hidden information. Baker would spend hours carefully transcribing intelligence onto the margins of her musical scores, between staff lines and in the blank spaces of the pages. To any casual observer, including German border guards and suspicious Vichy officials, the papers were exactly what they appeared to be, the working materials of a professional musician annotating her arrangements, marking tempo changes, noting performance details. The genius of the method was that it required no special equipment to create and could be executed anywhere Baker found herself with a pen and privacy. The pages looked completely innocent because on their surface they were innocent. Only chemical treatment would reveal the secrets hidden beneath the musical notation. Baker's travels took on a new dimension of danger as the war intensified. She journeyed to Portugal, a neutral country that had become a hotbed of espionage activity, where Allied and Axis agents operated in an uneasy coexistence. Lisbon was where intelligence changed hands, where refugees sought passage to freedom, and where the fate of nations was sometimes decided in whispered conversations in hotel lobbies. Baker performed there, her concerts serving as cover for meetings with British intelligence operatives who would receive the sheet music she had prepared in France. She would hand over her scores as if they were simply gifts or materials for potential collaboration, and those pages would make their way to London, where they would be developed and analysed. The information she provided helped Allied planners understand the true strength of German positions in France, identify weaknesses in their defensive networks, and plan operations that would eventually contribute to the liberation of Europe. But every trip was a gamble. The Nazis had agents everywhere, and the Gestapo was exceptionally skilled at identifying and eliminating resistance networks. The pressure of living a double life began to take its physical toll, but Baker never wavered in her commitment. She was playing the most dangerous role of her career, one where a single mistake, one moment of carelessness, one suspicious border guard deciding to examine her sheet music more closely could end in catastrophe. The woman who had once dazzled audiences with her fearless performances was now channeling that same fearlessness into something far more consequential. She understood that every piece of intelligence she smuggled out of occupied France potentially saved Allied lives, helped shorten the war, and brought liberation closer to the people who had given her a home when America had turned its back on her. The sheet music continued to flow, carried across borders in the hands of one of the world's most recognizable entertainers, hiding secrets that would help bring down the Third Reich one note at a time. By late 1940, the Nazi grip on France had tightened into something suffocating and absolute. The initial shock of occupation had given way to a grim new reality, where collaboration became commonplace, where neighbors informed on neighbors, and where the Gestapo's network of informants spread like a cancer through every level of French society. The Vichy government, that puppet regime that had sold out French sovereignty for the illusion of autonomy, was working hand in glove with the occupiers to hunt down resistance fighters, Jews, communists, and anyone else deemed an enemy of the new order. In this environment of paranoia and betrayal, continuing espionage work became exponentially more dangerous. The early days of the resistance, when amateurish enthusiasm could sometimes compensate for lack of training, were over. The Nazis had adapted. Their counterintelligence operations had become more sophisticated, and the price for getting caught had been demonstrated with public executions designed to terrorize the population into submission. Josephine Baker understood that the game had changed, that the margin for error had shrunk to nothing, yet she pressed forward with a determination that bordered on suicidal bravery. The invisible ink operation expanded in scope and ambition as Baker proved herself repeatedly. French intelligence began using her for increasingly sensitive missions, recognizing that her unique position offered opportunities that simply didn't exist for conventional operatives. She wasn't just attending parties anymore. She was being positioned to interact with high-ranking German officers, Vichy officials with access to classified information, and Italian military attachés who were surprisingly careless about operational security when beautiful women were present. Baker would engage them in conversation, flirt just enough to keep them talking, ask seemingly innocent questions about their work, and express admiration for their supposed military brilliance. The psychology was simple but effective. These men, far from home and surrounded by a population that despised them, craved validation and human connection. Baker provided both, all while cataloguing everything they revealed. She learned about new German defensive positions being constructed along the Atlantic coast, details about supply lines stretching back to the fatherland, and intelligence about internal conflicts within the German command structure that revealed exploitable weaknesses. The technical aspects of her tradecraft became increasingly sophisticated as the stakes rose higher. The sheet music method evolved beyond simple invisible ink messages to include more complex encoding systems. Baker began using specific musical notations as codes themselves, where certain markings on particular notes would correspond to predetermined intelligence categories. A sharp symbol in a specific position might indicate troop movements, a flat symbol could denote supply information, and tempo markings could encode dates and times. This created multiple layers of security. Even if someone discovered the invisible ink messages, they would still need to decode the musical notation system that provided additional context and verification. French intelligence also began providing Baker with microphotography equipment, allowing her to photograph documents she gained access to and hide the resulting microfilm within the binding of her sheet music folders. The technology was cutting edge for 1940, and placing it in the hands of an entertainer, rather than a trained spy, was a calculated gamble that paid extraordinary dividends. But as Baker's importance to the intelligence network grew, so did the danger. The Gestapo was not staffed by fools, and their counterintelligence officers were beginning to notice patterns. High society events attended by Baker sometimes preceded Allied operations that suggested insider knowledge of German positions. It was subtle, perhaps too subtle to build a case on, but it was enough to put her name on lists of persons of interest. Baker became aware of increased surveillance. She noticed the same faces appearing at multiple venues, recognized the telltale signs of professional watchers, and understood that her window of operational security was closing. The resistance network made the decision to exfiltrate her from France before the net closed completely. In late 1940, Baker received orders to relocate her operations to North Africa, where Free French forces were organizing and where her talents could be utilized with slightly less immediate risk of capture. The cover story was perfect. She would be touring, performing for troops and colonial populations, exactly the kind of thing a patriotic entertainer might do to support the war effort. The journey from occupied France to North Africa required crossing multiple borders, passing through numerous checkpoints, and maintaining her cover under increasingly scrutinizing examination. Baker traveled with trunks full of costumes, personal belongings, and of course sheet music. Dozens of pages of scores, each one potentially containing intelligence that could get her executed if discovered. At the Spanish border, German officials searched her luggage with meticulous attention, looking through her personal effects with an invasiveness that felt violating. They held up her sheet music, examined the pages, even made jokes about not understanding musical notation. Baker smiled, laughed at their jokes, played the role of the frivolous entertainer grateful for their attention. Inside, her heart hammered against her ribs, knowing that those seemingly innocent pages contained information about German submarine bases, Luftwaffe deployment schedules, and Wehrmacht supply routes. The guards found nothing suspicious and waved her through. The sheet music continued its journey, carrying secrets that would soon be in the hands of Allied intelligence, all smuggled out under the noses of the very people it would help destroy. North Africa in 1941 was a theater of war unlike anything else, a vast desert battleground where Rommel's Afrika Korps and British Commonwealth forces engaged in a deadly dance across endless sand. But it was also a complex political landscape where colonial powers, local populations, Vichy loyalists and Free French supporters existed in uneasy proximity. For Josephine Baker, arriving in Morocco and Algeria meant entering a new phase of her secret war, one where the threat was less immediate than occupied France, but where the intelligence work became even more crucial. The Free French forces under Charles de Gaulle desperately needed information about Vichy military strength in North Africa, about German plans for the region, and about potential weak points that could be exploited when the time came for liberation. Baker's mission evolved from passive intelligence gathering to active recruitment and coordination. She was no longer just a courier carrying secrets in her sheet music. She was becoming a node in a growing resistance network, using her fame and access to identify sympathetic officials, locate potential defectors, and map out the complex web of loyalties that would determine North Africa's fate. Her cover as a touring entertainer remained perfect and unassailable. Baker performed for troops, both Vichy and Free French, for colonial administrators, and for civilian populations hungry for entertainment in a region consumed by uncertainty and fear. Each performance was an intelligence operation disguised as a show. She would note which officers attended, observe who spoke to whom during intermissions, and identify individuals who seemed uncomfortable with the Vichy regime or who expressed quiet sympathy for the Free French cause. These observations would be meticulously recorded, not on paper that could be discovered, but memorized using techniques she had perfected over months of espionage work. Later, in private meetings with her handlers, she would download everything she had observed, providing intelligence analysts with a human map of the political landscape that no amount of signals, intercepts, or aerial reconnaissance could reveal. The sheet music method continued to prove its worth. Baker would receive intelligence from other resistance operatives, information that needed to reach London or Free French headquarters in distant locations, and she would transcribe it onto her musical scores using the invisible ink and encoded notation systems she had mastered. The North African campaign created opportunities for Baker's talents that hadn't existed in occupied France. The fluid front lines, the movement of troops across vast distances, and the complex logistics of desert warfare meant that intelligence about supply routes, water sources, and defensive positions was worth its weight in gold. Baker found herself in situations where German and Italian officers, far from the scrutiny of their superiors, and desperate for any connection to European culture and sophistication, would speak with shocking indiscretion. She attended dinners where Africa Corps officers complained about fuel shortages, revealing vulnerabilities in their supply chain. She heard Italian commanders express frustration about poor coordination with their German allies, intelligence that suggested exploitable rifts in Axis unity. Every conversation, every overhead complaint, every careless boast became data points that Baker filed away in her remarkable memory. The sheet music she carried became a rolling archive of military intelligence, with pages being continuously updated, replaced, and forwarded to intelligence networks that stretched from Casablanca to Cairo to London. But the work was taking its toll in ways that went beyond simple physical exhaustion. The constant performance, the need to always be on guard, the weight of knowing that lives depended on the accuracy of her reporting, all of it created a psychological pressure that would have broken most people. Baker began to suffer from severe illness, stress-related conditions that her doctors couldn't fully diagnose, but that left her weakened and vulnerable. Yet even from a hospital bed in Casablanca, she continued her work. Resistance operatives would visit her under the guise of well-wishers, and she would brief them on intelligence she had gathered before her collapse. The sheet music method proved adaptable even to her hospital confinement. Messages would be smuggled in and out using the scores she kept by her bedside, pages that nurses and visitors assumed were simply there to provide comfort to a musician separated from her art. The invisible ink messages continued to flow, though now they were written by a woman fighting not just against the Nazis, but against her own body's rebellion against the impossible demands she had placed upon it. By 1942, Baker had been operating as a spy for nearly 2 years, an eternity in the world of wartime espionage where life expectancy was often measured in months. She had smuggled intelligence across a dozen borders, recruited assets who would prove crucial to the North African campaign, and provided Allied commanders with information that directly contributed to military operations. The sheet music that had started as a clever improvisation had become a systematic method of intelligence transmission, so successful that French intelligence began training other operatives in similar techniques. Baker had proven that the best cover for espionage wasn't invisibility, but rather hypervisibility. That fame could be weaponized as effectively as any technical tradecraft. The woman who had once been dismissed as merely an entertainer had become one of the most effective intelligence operatives in the Free French arsenal, all while the world continued to see only the performer, never the spy hiding in plain sight behind the musical notes. The Allied invasion of North Africa in November 1942, Operation Torch, represented a turning point, not just in the war, but in Josephine Baker's espionage career. The intelligence she had been gathering for 2 years suddenly became operational gold. The network she had helped build, the defector contacts she had cultivated, the detailed information about Vichy military positions and loyalties all came together in a cascade of actionable intelligence that helped Allied forces secure beachheads with less resistance than had been feared. Baker had identified key Vichy officers who were secretly sympathetic to the Free French cause, men who would order their troops to offer only token resistance or who would facilitate the rapid surrender of strategic positions. She had mapped out the complicated political dynamics that would determine whether local populations would welcome Allied forces or resist them. The sheet music that had traveled through her hands over countless performances had helped create an intelligence picture so detailed that Allied commanders knew more about Vichy North Africa than some of the Vichy commanders themselves knew about their own forces. This was the validation of everything Baker had risked, the proof that her seemingly impossible mission had been worth the danger, the illness, the constant fear of exposure. But victory in North Africa didn't mean the end of her war. As Allied forces consolidated control and began preparing for the eventual invasion of Sicily and then mainland Europe, Baker's role evolved yet again. She became a morale officer, touring with Allied forces, performing for troops who were preparing for the brutal campaigns ahead. Yet even in this seemingly straightforward role, her intelligence work continued. She gathered information about troop morale, identified potential security risks, and reported on the effectiveness of various units and commanders. The Free French forces, now reorganized and growing stronger with each passing month, relied on her assessments of personnel and her ability to identify talent within their ranks. Her performances became recruitment opportunities, chances to inspire French colonial troops, and convince wavering Vichy soldiers to join the fight for liberation. The sheet music she carried was less likely to contain military secrets now, but it still served as a communication channel, a way to pass messages between resistance cells that were now operating more openly but still needed secure communications. Baker had become an institution within Free French intelligence, a proven operative whose methods had been vindicated by results. The physical cost of her years in the field became impossible to ignore by late 1942. The illnesses that had plagued her in Casablanca returned with a vengeance, complicated by the harsh conditions of North African life and the cumulative stress of years lived on the edge of discovery and death. She spent months in and out of hospitals, suffering from infections, exhaustion, and complications that doctors struggled to treat with the limited medical resources available in a war zone. There were moments when it seemed she might not survive, when the woman who had outsmarted the Gestapo and outmaneuvered Vichy counterintelligence might be defeated by her own body's collapse. Yet even in her weakest moments, Baker refused to abandon the cause. She continued to receive visitors from French intelligence, continued to provide insights and assessments, and continued to plan for her return to active duty once her health improved. The commitment was absolute, almost frightening in its intensity. Baker had found in the resistance something she had searched for her entire life, a cause worthy of total sacrifice, a fight where her contributions mattered not because of her entertainment value, but because of her courage, intelligence, and unwavering dedication. By 1943, as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Italy and the long road back to France, Baker had recovered enough to resume limited duties. She could no longer maintain the grueling schedule of constant travel and performances that had characterized her early espionage work, but she remained valuable for her connections, her knowledge of personnel, and her ability to inspire troops preparing for the most difficult campaigns of the war. The Free French forces had grown from a ragtag collection of exiles into a legitimate military force, and Baker had been part of that transformation from the earliest days. She wore a Free French Air Force uniform now, having been officially inducted into the Women's Auxiliary, though her rank and decorations only hinted at the true nature of her service. The sheet music method had largely been phased out as more conventional communication systems became available in liberated territories, but Baker kept some of those marked pages as personal mementos of a time when musical notation had been her weapon and invisibility in plain sight had been her shield. The woman who performed on stages across North Africa in 1943 was different from the terrified but determined spy who had first walked into Jacques Abte's office back in Paris. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had been tested in the most extreme circumstances and had not been found wanting. The audiences who watched her perform saw a legendary entertainer giving her all for the troops, and that was true enough. But beneath the sequins and behind the famous smile was a decorated intelligence operative who had smuggled secrets across a continent, built resistance networks from scratch, and contributed to military victories through sheer courage and improvisation. The sheet music that had once hidden messages in invisible ink now contained only melodies, but those pages represented something profound. They were proof that the most effective weapons in war are sometimes the most unexpected, that heroism comes in forms the history books rarely recognize, and that sometimes the person everyone underestimates turns out to be the one who changes everything. The liberation of Paris in August 1944 was a moment of ecstatic triumph that seemed impossible just years earlier when Nazi banners had flown from the Eiffel Tower and collaborators had walked freely through streets where resistance fighters had been hunted like animals. Josephine Baker returned to her adopted city not as a refugee or a fugitive, but as a uniformed member of the Free French forces, wearing the insignia of a sub-lieutenant and carrying decorations that acknowledged, however incompletely, her service to France. The crowds that lined the streets to welcome Charles de Gaulle and the liberating forces didn't know the full story of what Baker had done. They saw a beloved entertainer who had remained loyal when so many had chosen collaboration or comfortable exile. They didn't know about the sheet music covered in invisible ink, the intelligence networks she had built, the risks she had taken every single day for years. The secrecy that had protected her during the war now meant that her contributions would remain largely unknown, buried in classified files and known only to the intelligence officers who had worked with her directly. This was the price of successful espionage work. The most effective operatives are the ones whose stories are never told, whose heroism remains forever hidden, because revealing it would compromise methods and endanger others who continue the work. Baker's post-liberation life became a complex negotiation between her public persona and her secret history. She resumed performing, though with less frequency than before the war, using her fame to support reconstruction efforts and to advocate for the causes she believed in. But she also continued to work with French intelligence services in ways that remained classified for decades. The Cold War was beginning to take shape, and operatives with Baker's experience and international connections were valuable assets in a new kind of conflict. She traveled extensively, performing around the world, and while most of these trips were exactly what they appeared to be, some served dual purposes that echoed her wartime activities. The techniques she had pioneered, the use of celebrity as cover for intelligence work, became part of the standard tradecraft taught to new generations of operatives. Intelligence agencies around the world studied her methods, recognizing that she had stumbled upon something profound about human psychology and the nature of effective deception. People see what they expect to see, and no one expects a glamorous entertainer to be a trained intelligence operative carrying military secrets in sheet music. The French government began to officially recognize her wartime service in the years following liberation, though always in carefully measured ways that didn't reveal operational details. In 1946, she was awarded the Croix de Guerre for her military service, a decoration given to those who had distinguished themselves through acts of heroism involving combat with enemy forces. The citation was necessarily vague, mentioning her service to Free French forces and her contributions to the liberation, but avoiding any specifics about espionage activities. Later that same year, she received the Rosette de la Résistance, another honor that acknowledged her role in the underground fight against occupation. These decorations meant everything to Baker. They were France's way of saying that she belonged, that her contributions had been seen and valued, that the country she had adopted had not forgotten what she had sacrificed on its behalf. For a woman who had spent her early life being told she was less than, who had endured the humiliation of American segregation, these French honors represented a validation that transcended mere military recognition. But perhaps the most significant recognition came in 1961, 15 years after the war's end, when Baker was made a Chevalier of the Legion of Honor, France's highest decoration. The ceremony was conducted with full military honors, and while the citation still couldn't reveal the complete truth of her wartime activities, those who knew understood what was really being honored. Baker stood in her uniform, now decades removed from the desperate days of occupation and resistance, receiving an honor that placed her among France's greatest heroes. The medal pinned to her chest represented not just her individual courage, but the courage of all those who had resisted when resistance seemed futile, who had fought when fighting seemed suicidal, and who had believed in liberation when the Nazis seemed invincible. The sheet music method, that improvised technique born of necessity and brilliant simplicity, had never been publicly revealed. It remained classified, a secret shared only among intelligence professionals who studied its elegant effectiveness. Baker never wrote a memoir that detailed her espionage work, never sought publicity for the most important thing she had ever done. The discretion that had kept her alive during the war continued to govern her conduct in peace. The America that Baker had left behind in the 1920s had changed dramatically by the 1950s and 60s, but not enough. She returned periodically to perform and was shocked to find that segregation still dominated much of the country, that the racism she had escaped decades earlier remained entrenched and violent. She used her French decorations and her status as a war hero to challenge American racism directly. When hotels refused to accommodate her because of her race, she would appear in her French military uniform, wearing her medals, and force them to confront the absurdity of discriminating against a decorated war hero. When the civil rights movement gained momentum, Baker became one of its international voices, using her platform to shame America by contrasting French acceptance with American bigotry. The woman who had smuggled intelligence in sheet music now smuggled a different kind of message, one about dignity, equality, and the bankruptcy of racial prejudice. France had given her what America never would, the recognition that her worth as a human being wasn't determined by the color of her skin. The medals she wore weren't just military honors. They were proof that heroism transcends race, that courage has no color, and that sometimes the people society dismisses as entertainment turn out to be the ones who save nations. The full scope of Josephine Baker's espionage career remained locked in classified French intelligence archives for decades after the war ended, a deliberate obscurity that served multiple purposes. The methods she had pioneered were still considered operationally sensitive, potentially useful in future conflicts, where similar techniques might be employed. The networks she had helped build, the contacts she had cultivated, many of them remained active in French intelligence circles throughout the Cold War era. Revealing the details of her work would have compromised ongoing operations and exposed individuals who had cooperated with her, and who might still be vulnerable to retaliation. But beyond operational security concerns, there was another reason for the silence. The full truth of what Baker had accomplished was so extraordinary, so improbable, that intelligence agencies worried it might seem fabricated if revealed publicly. The idea that one of the world's most famous entertainers had spent years smuggling military secrets in sheet music, recruiting resistance fighters, and outwitting Nazi counterintelligence sounded like the plot of a Hollywood thriller, not the sober historical record of wartime espionage. The very audacity of her operation, which had been its greatest strength during the war, became a liability to its historical credibility afterward. It wasn't until the 1970s and 80s, as wartime intelligence files began to be gradually declassified, and as historians gained access to previously sealed records, that the full picture of Baker's contributions started to emerge. Researchers combing through French military intelligence archives discovered references to an operative codenamed Creole Goddess, who had conducted extensive intelligence operations throughout occupied France and North Africa. Cross-referencing these files with other documents revealed that Creole Goddess was Josephine Baker, and that her activities had been far more extensive than the vague official citations had suggested. The invisible ink messages on sheet music, initially dismissed by some historians as possible embellishment, were confirmed through multiple independent sources. Intelligence officers who had worked with Baker during the war, now elderly and freed from secrecy oaths by time and declassification, began to share their first-hand accounts. They described her photographic memory, her ability to extract information from targets without raising suspicion, and her absolute fearlessness in the face of mortal danger. These testimonies painted a picture of an espionage operation that had been remarkably sophisticated despite its improvisational origins. The sheet music method itself became a subject of fascination for intelligence historians and tradecraft experts. Analysis revealed layers of sophistication that Baker and her handlers had developed over time. The invisible ink was just the first layer of security. The musical notation itself had been weaponized as a code, with specific markings corresponding to intelligence categories. Even the choice of which compositions to use had significance, with certain pieces indicating the priority level of the information contained within. A Mozart sonata might carry routine intelligence, while a Beethoven symphony could indicate urgent material requiring immediate attention. This system allowed Baker to communicate not just content, but context, giving her handlers crucial information about how to prioritize and act upon the intelligence she was smuggling. The elegance of the system was that it required no special equipment beyond what any touring musician would naturally possess, could be executed anywhere, and would appear completely innocent even under close scrutiny. It represented a perfect fusion of Baker's artistic life and her secret war, transforming the tools of her profession into weapons against fascism. The human cost of her espionage work also became clearer as more information emerged. The illnesses that had nearly killed her in North Africa were directly attributable to the stress and conditions of her intelligence work. She had contracted infections during travel through dangerous territories, suffered malnutrition while maintaining her cover in resource-scarce regions, and developed stress-related conditions from years of living with the constant possibility of exposure and execution. Medical records revealed that doctors had advised her repeatedly to cease her activities, that her handlers had offered to extract her from operations due to health concerns, and that she had refused every time. The commitment bordered on obsession, driven by a complex mixture of gratitude to France, fury at Nazi ideology, and a deep-seated need to prove her worth through sacrifice. Baker had spent her childhood being told she was worthless because of her race, and the resistance gave her an opportunity to demonstrate value so profound that no one could ever diminish it. The sheet music she carried wasn't just smuggling intelligence, it was carrying proof of her own significance, validation written in invisible ink that would eventually be revealed for history to judge. By the time Baker died in 1975, just days after a triumphant comeback performance in Paris, she had lived long enough to see some acknowledgement of her wartime service, though the full details remained classified. Her funeral was a state affair, with full military honors and a 21-gun salute, the first American-born woman to receive such recognition from the French government. Thousands lined the streets to pay respects, seeing her off as the legend she had become. But even in death, the complete truth of what she had accomplished remained partially hidden, waiting in archives for future generations to discover. The sheet music that had once carried secrets capable of changing the course of battles was scattered now, some pieces preserved in museums, others lost to time, and still others sitting in intelligence archives where they remained classified decades after the events they documented. Each page represented a small act of resistance, a moment when Josephine Baker had chosen courage over safety, and collectively they told a story of heroism that the world was only beginning to understand. The invisible ink had long since faded or been revealed, but the legacy it recorded was becoming clearer with each passing year, each declassified document, each historian who dove deeper into the archives and emerged with another piece of an extraordinary puzzle. The strategic impact of Baker's intelligence work can only truly be appreciated when examining specific operations where her information proved decisive. One particularly crucial contribution came in early 1943, when Allied planners were preparing for what would eventually become the invasion of Sicily and the Italian campaign. Baker had cultivated a relationship with a high-ranking Italian naval officer stationed in North Africa, who was disillusioned with Mussolini's regime and increasingly skeptical of Italy's alliance with Germany. Over the course of several carefully orchestrated social encounters, she gained his confidence and learned details about Italian coastal defenses, the morale problems plaguing Italian forces, and critically, the growing sentiment among Italian military leadership that the war was lost and that continuing to fight alongside Germany was national suicide. This intelligence, meticulously transcribed onto her sheet music and smuggled to Allied headquarters, contributed directly to the Allied decision to target Italy as the soft underbelly of Axis Europe. The information Baker provided about weak points in Italian defenses and the possibility of negotiating an Italian surrender helped shape the entire Mediterranean strategy that would eventually knock Italy out of the war and force Germany to divert crucial resources to defend territory they had assumed was secure. Another operation where Baker's intelligence proved invaluable involved the identification of a Vichy official in Morocco who was secretly sympathetic to the Free French but was trapped in his position by family circumstances and fear of German retaliation. Baker had met him at a diplomatic reception where she was performing, and she recognized the subtle signs of a man deeply uncomfortable with the regime he served. Over subsequent encounters, she carefully cultivated a relationship built on shared cultural interests and what appeared to be innocent conversation about music and art. The official, never suspecting that the famous entertainer was actually a trained intelligence operative, gradually revealed his true sympathies and his access to information about Vichy military dispositions in North Africa. Baker recruited him as an asset, providing him with methods to pass information safely and giving French intelligence a window into Vichy planning that proved crucial during Operation Torch. When Allied forces landed, this official used his position to facilitate the surrender of key installations, saving lives and accelerating the North African campaign. His cooperation was a direct result of Baker's recruitment skills, her ability to identify potential assets and bring them into the fold without ever revealing her true purpose until the moment was right. The psychological dimension of Baker's work deserves particular attention because it reveals the sophistication of her tradecraft. She understood instinctively what intelligence agencies spent years training operatives to recognize: that people reveal secrets, not because they're tricked, but because they want to connect, to impress, to share the burden of knowledge that isolates them. The German and Italian officers she targeted were far from home, surrounded by hostile populations and desperately lonely for connection to the civilization they believed they represented. Baker provided that connection, became for them a symbol of European culture and sophistication in an alien environment. They talked to her not because she interrogated them, but because she made them feel important, listened with apparent admiration to their stories, and created an emotional space where sharing secrets felt like intimacy rather than betrayal. This psychological manipulation required extraordinary emotional intelligence and a willingness to use her own humanity as a weapon. Every smile, every laugh, every moment of apparent connection was calculated and controlled, a performance far more demanding than anything she had ever done on stage. The toll this took on her psyche was immense, creating a dissociation between the public Baker and the private operative that would affect her for the rest of her life. The technical evolution of her methods also accelerated as the war progressed and technology advanced. By 1943, French intelligence had provided Baker with micro-cameras that could photograph documents quickly and discreetly. She learned to use these devices while maintaining her cover as an entertainer, photographing papers during brief moments when she was left alone in offices or when targets carelessly left sensitive materials visible during social gatherings. The resulting microfilm would be concealed within the binding of her sheet music folders, creating an additional layer of hidden intelligence beyond the invisible ink messages on the pages themselves. This combination of old and new tradecraft, invisible ink and microphotography, musical code and photographic evidence, made Baker's operations remarkably productive. A single performance tour could yield intelligence reports, photographic documentation, and recruited assets, all smuggled out of hostile territory inside materials that appeared completely innocuous. The volume of intelligence she generated was staggering, and analysis of declassified records suggests that her productivity rivaled or exceeded that of entire intelligence networks operating in the same theaters. Perhaps most remarkably, Baker continued to innovate her methods even as her health deteriorated, and as the operational environment became more dangerous. When illness confined her to hospitals, she adapted by using visitors as couriers and medical staff as unwitting participants in intelligence operations. When travel became restricted, she developed methods to operate within smaller geographic ranges while maintaining productivity. When German counterintelligence began to tighten security around public performances, she shifted to private gatherings where she could exercise more control over the environment and the attendees. This adaptability, this refusal to be stopped by obstacles that would have ended most operations, was perhaps her greatest contribution to intelligence tradecraft. She demonstrated that effective espionage is not about following rigid protocols, but about creative adaptation to constantly changing circumstances. The sheet music method itself was an adaptation, born from necessity and perfected through practice. Every challenge she faced became an opportunity to innovate, to find new ways to accomplish the mission, to turn limitations into advantages. This mindset, documented in the after-action reports that survived in archives, became a model for how intelligence operatives should approach impossible situations, and Baker's example was studied and emulated long after the war ended. The post-war revelation of Baker's espionage activities, gradual and incomplete as it was, created a complex legacy that intersected with broader narratives about race, gender, and heroism in World War II. For decades, the dominant stories of wartime resistance had centered on white male combatants and operatives, with women and people of color relegated to supporting roles or omitted entirely from historical accounts. Baker's story challenged these narratives in fundamental ways. Here was a Black American woman who had not only participated in the resistance, but had been one of its most effective operatives, using methods that intelligence professionals considered brilliant and achieving results that directly impacted military outcomes. The cognitive dissonance this created was profound. How could someone dismissed by American society as merely an exotic entertainer, someone denied basic rights in her own country because of her race, have been capable of such sophisticated and consequential intelligence work? The question forced a reckoning with assumptions about who gets to be a hero, whose contributions count as significant, and how intelligence and capability are distributed across lines of race and gender that society had constructed as barriers to achievement. The sheet music method became emblematic of this larger challenge to conventional wisdom. Intelligence historians had long assumed that effective espionage required extensive training, technical expertise, and the kind of institutional support that only state intelligence agencies could provide. Baker's improvised system, born from necessity and refined through practice rather than formal instruction, demonstrated that creativity and courage could sometimes achieve what formal training could not. The fact that she had weaponized the very tools of her artistic profession, turning musical scores into vehicles for military secrets, revealed an imaginative approach to problem-solving that traditional intelligence doctrine had overlooked. Moreover, the fact that her greatest advantage had been her race and gender, characteristics that both American and European society generally treated as liabilities, represented a profound irony. The Nazi officers and Vichy collaborators who dismissed her as merely entertainment, who never imagined she could be dangerous, were undone by their own prejudices. They couldn't conceive that a black woman entertainer might be a trained intelligence operative, because their worldview didn't allow for that possibility. Baker had turned their racism and sexism into weapons against them, using their blindness as her invisibility cloak. The gradual declassification of her files also revealed the extent to which institutional prejudice had continued, even within the resistance movement itself. While French intelligence had recognized her value and utilized her extensively, internal documents showed persistent skepticism from some officials who questioned whether an entertainer could really be trusted with sensitive operations. Some of the reluctance to fully deploy her capabilities stemmed from legitimate security concerns about her high profile, but other objections reflected the same dismissive attitudes that pervaded society at large. Baker had to prove herself repeatedly, achieving results that went beyond what was expected, before she was granted access to more significant operations. The fact that she succeeded despite this institutional resistance, that she became one of the most decorated women in French military history, despite starting from a position where many doubted her abilities, made her accomplishments even more remarkable. She had fought not just against the Nazis, but against the prejudices of those supposedly on her own side, and she had won both battles through sheer excellence and unbreakable determination. The cultural impact of Baker's espionage story extended beyond historical correction to influence how intelligence agencies thought about recruitment and operational methods. By the 1980s and 1990s, as her story became more widely known, intelligence services around the world began to reconsider their approach to both personnel selection and tradecraft development. The realization that one of World War II's most effective operatives had been someone traditional recruitment would have overlooked prompted serious examination of whether modern intelligence agencies were making similar mistakes. Were they dismissing potential assets because those individuals didn't fit conventional profiles? Were they overlooking innovative approaches to espionage because they didn't align with established doctrine? Baker's example suggested that the answer to both questions was probably yes. Intelligence agencies began to actively seek out individuals with unconventional backgrounds, recognizing that artists, entertainers, business people, and others whose professions gave them access and cover might be more valuable than conventionally trained operatives in certain contexts. The sheet music method itself became a case study in how to hide intelligence in plain sight, leading to research into other professions and activities that could be similarly weaponized. The personal cost of Baker's secret war remained largely hidden even as the operational details emerged. The strain of living a double life for years, of constantly performing for audiences who never knew the truth, of using personal relationships as intelligence tools, created psychological scars that she carried for the rest of her life. Friends and family members who were interviewed after her death described a woman who struggled with trust, who had difficulty forming genuine, intimate connections, and who seemed to maintain a performative distance even in private moments. The skills that had kept her alive during the war, the ability to compartmentalize, to manipulate emotions, to always be calculating the angles, became maladaptive in peacetime. She had trained herself to see everyone as either an asset or a threat, and unlearning that mindset proved nearly impossible. The Baker who returned to performing after the war was not the same person who had walked into Jacques Abte's office in 1940. The war had taken something from her that could never be recovered, a certain innocence about human nature and a capacity for unguarded emotional connection. The sheet music that had carried secrets across continents had also carried away pieces of her soul, leaving behind a woman who had saved thousands of lives but who could never fully reclaim her own. Today, more than 8 decades after Josephine Baker first walked into a French intelligence office and offered her services, her story remains one of the most extraordinary and least known chapters of World War II espionage history. The sheet music that once carried invisible ink messages sits in museum collections and private archives. The chemical traces long since faded or revealed, but the legacy of what those pages represented continues to resonate. In an era where the contributions of women and people of color to the war effort are finally receiving the recognition they deserve, Baker's story stands as perhaps the most dramatic example of heroism hidden in plain sight. She was not a soldier who charged into battle, not a spy who worked in shadows, but something more complex and ultimately more effective. She was a weapon disguised as entertainment, an intelligence operation masquerading as art. proof that the most dangerous operatives are sometimes the ones no one takes seriously. The Nazis who applauded her performances, who flirted with her at parties, who never imagined she could be their enemy, learned too late that underestimating people based on race and gender is not just morally wrong, but strategically catastrophic. The full accounting of lives saved by Baker's intelligence work will never be known. The nature of espionage is that its successes are measured in disasters prevented, battles won with less bloodshed, operations that succeeded because commanders had information they shouldn't have possessed. But historians who have analyzed the declassified records estimate that the intelligence she provided contributed to operations that saved thousands of Allied lives and shortened campaigns that might have dragged on for months or years. The Italian officer she recruited, the Vichy official she turned, the intelligence about German positions she smuggled out of France, all of these contributed to Allied victories that are remembered today without any mention of the woman who made them possible. This is the fundamental paradox of successful espionage work. The better you do your job, the less credit you receive, because revealing how victories were achieved would compromise the methods and endanger the people who made them possible. Baker accepted this bargain, choosing effectiveness over recognition, knowing that her contributions would remain classified long after she was gone. The medals she received acknowledged her service, but could never fully describe what she had accomplished or what she had sacrificed to accomplish it. The erasure of Baker's espionage legacy from popular consciousness was not entirely accidental. Post-war narratives about the resistance movement were carefully curated by governments that wanted to emphasize national unity and minimize uncomfortable truths about collaboration and the extensive German intelligence networks that had operated during occupation. Baker's story was inconvenient for multiple reasons. It highlighted how easily the Nazis had been deceived, which raised questions about the competence of German counterintelligence that former Wehrmacht officers found embarrassing. It demonstrated that American racism had driven away talent that benefited France, which complicated efforts to maintain the Atlantic Alliance during the Cold War. And perhaps most significantly, it challenged comfortable assumptions about who gets to be a hero, forcing societies on both sides of the Atlantic to confront their own prejudices. It was easier to remember Baker as an entertainer who had remained loyal to France than to grapple with the full implications of her intelligence career and what it revealed about the systematic underestimation of women and minorities that had characterized Western society. But the truth has a way of emerging eventually, and Baker's story has been gradually reclaimed by historians, artists, and activists who recognize its profound importance. In 2021, nearly 50 years after her death, France took an unprecedented step by inducting Josephine Baker into the Pantheon, the final resting place of France's most honored citizens. She became the first black woman to receive this recognition, joining a collection of philosophers, writers, scientists, and leaders whose contributions shaped French history. The ceremony acknowledged not just her entertainment career, but explicitly recognized her wartime service and her lifelong fight for civil rights. The sheet music method, once classified, was described in detail during the ceremony as an example of her ingenuity and courage. The invisible ink messages were no longer secret. They had become symbols of resistance, creativity, and the power of underestimated people to change history. The Pantheon induction represented a correction of historical record, France finally giving full public recognition to a hero whose story had been incomplete for too long. The lessons of Josephine Baker's espionage career extend far beyond the historical record of World War II. In an age where intelligence work increasingly relies on technology and surveillance, her story reminds us that the most sophisticated systems can be defeated by human creativity and courage. In a world still grappling with racism and sexism, her achievements demonstrate the catastrophic cost of prejudice, not just in moral terms but in practical effectiveness. The talents that society dismisses, the people it underestimates, the capabilities it refuses to recognize, all represent untapped potential that could be solving problems, winning conflicts, and changing outcomes. Baker's sheet music carried more than military secrets. It carried a message about human potential that transcends the specific circumstances of wartime espionage. Every person dismissed because of their race, their gender, their background, or their unconventional path might be the next Josephine Baker, capable of extraordinary contributions if given the chance. The Nazi officers who saw only an entertainer and missed the spy were making the same mistake that society continues to make every day. Baker's legacy is not just about what she accomplished, but about what her story reveals about all the other heroes whose contributions remain hidden, dismissed, or erased. The invisible ink on her sheet music has been revealed, but how many other stories remain invisible, waiting for someone to apply the right chemical, ask the right questions, and bring hidden heroism into the light where it belongs?